Two researchers on a ghost hunt. Neuroscientist Jason Braithwaite from the University of Lancaster and cultural anthropologist Deborah Hyde want to investigate the haunting in one of England's spookiest castles. Muncaster Castle near Ravenglass in the Lake District. Are there really ghosts around?
Muncaster Castle has had a lot of stories over many, many years. My personal sceptical belief is that a good ghost story is a way of keeping the locals off the estate, because nobody wants to go near the place after dark, and so it works as a kind of security mechanism 200 or 300 years ago. However, I have spoken to a number of people that claim to have had strange experiences here in the castle over the years that require perhaps a clearer eye cast on them and try to look at them and get to grips with them and see what might be going on.
Peter Frost Pennington and his family live in the castle, as have some 30 generations of Penningtons before them. And they ask themselves, are we really alone within these old walls?
My wife and I have heard footsteps in the room above when we were in bed, and we knew no one else was in the castle, and we heard tick, 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 tick. Strange things happen here. Very little has happened to me personally, but I have talked to many people who have had strange things happen to them, and some people have been really quite scared. So that is why I think it is haunted, and very odd things happen.
Especially in the tapestry room. Overnight guests have heard a child crying here quite often. Or steps. And sometimes the door handle turns as if by magic. Or the door jumps open. There are even reports of apparitions. An icy cold. And people feel they're being watched. Peter Frost Pennington knows the room's history. He knows the ghost haunting the room. Not far from the castle, in this chapel, there is a reference to her. A baptismal font with the name Margaret Susan Elizabeth.
Unfortunately, in 1861, the fourth Lord Muncaster died in Italy, and so Margaret was his only child. She inherited the castle, but died age 11 in 1871 of what we were told were screaming fits. It's such a sad story, poor little Margaret, who we think can still be sometimes met by people in her bedroom in the castle, where not all the time, but occasionally overnight, people have heard her weeping.
In the tapestry room, her former children's room.
Crying children is a reasonably common motif. And in ghost stories and supernatural stories in general, in a lot of folklore, actually, people seem to be okay with the idea that they die after a long and happy life. But you get an awful lot of folklore associated with premature death. So a crying baby doesn't surprise me. That would be unfinished business, in effect.
The Penningtons have inhabited the castle for centuries. Peter married into the family.
What I find fascinating about Muncaster is we have that tradition of stories being passed down generation from generation. And you think, well, they're just stories. And time again, not just the ghost stories, but other stories about the castle, when we do research, you find the research backs up the story. And quite sometimes you go, that fits.
One of these stories is about the court jester Thomas Skelton. As a ghost, he's said to still roam the castle today.
Tom Skelton's an interesting ghost. His memory is very much alive here because the family have really taken him to their hearts. They interpret things in the light of Tom Skelton and his activities. And they like to feel, I think, that he's really benign towards the family, that he cares about them, he looks after them. In real life, there were rumours that Tom Skelton wasn't so kind to strangers. And as a ghost here, he seems to be a kind of a trickster. Where he will frighten or trick people who he doesn't know, strangers.
Tom Fool's Tree still exists today. Legend has it that in the 16th century, the court jester liked to sit under this tree. If travellers came by and asked for directions, he allegedly sent them into the quicksand if he didn't like them. They also say the ghost of Mary Bragg still haunts this place. Legend has it that the maid met a violent end near the castle about 200 years ago.
The White Lady is a very common motif in a lot of English and Latin-speaking countries, and it's usually associated with young women who are cut off in their prime. They're wrongfully murdered, they're killed, and they have some energy left, some justice that they need to visit back on the world.
Motorists report the White Lady appeared to them on a road outside Muncaster Castle.
We have accounts from eyewitnesses that have encountered this apparent spectre or ghost on the perimeter road of the estate, dating from the late 1980s and early 1990s. I've interviewed these people and they are absolutely adamant about what they saw and what happened and what they collided with and so on and so forth. So they are very clear in their minds about what took place. There's always a twist in the story as well, because whilst the driver may well have seen the figure on the road, the passenger didn't.
According to surveys, more people in Britain believe in ghosts than in God.
Well, as far as we can tell, belief in ghosts is everywhere, really. Most religious systems have some form of ghost or demon, and most countries have ghost stories, understand the nature of a ghost story. In England, I think that we find it particularly easy because we're surrounded by artefacts, by things you can literally touch, places you can walk into. We have castles and Stonehenge and just history all over the place.
Muncaster Castle also has a long history, and many legends. Are these ghosts in the end just ghost stories that the Penningtons pass on from generation to generation?
I originally came to Muncaster Castle because I was interested in a lot of the local stories and legends. But what really interested me was when I started to talk to people that had been here and experienced things, they were really reporting to me the wrong ghost. They were not experiencing the sorts of things that were in the legends and the local folklore. They were experiencing something very different. And that intrigued me. And I thought, as a scientist and as a skeptic, I would try to look at that a little more.
Jason Braithwaite spoke to the eyewitnesses. His research always focuses on the human brain.
Eyewitness reports are valuable. However, they are anecdotal. So while people can be reporting what they genuinely felt that they experienced, the human brain is fallible. It gives you a fascinating window into the nature of these strange experiences. But just because you may think you've seen or experienced a ghost does not mean that ghosts are real. There could be more rational and scientific explanations, and I would suggest there are.
Together with Deborah Hyde, Jason Braithwaite wants to take another closer look at the tapestry room. He has examined and measured it for many years. The neuroscientist is looking for explanations for the ghostly apparitions.
Where we ask people to try to We have, in one area, highlighted a magnetic anomaly, is what we would call it. Whether or not it has the potency and characteristics to actually induce strange experiences, we have yet to actually physically test in the laboratory. But it may or may not be a coincidence that this magnetic anomaly, quite a striking anomaly, exists exactly in the room and in the bed area where many occupants have been and reported very striking, strange experiences. We've yet to explore whether these two factors are connected.
Margaret Bragg's former children's room, the tapestry room, is said to be the spookiest room in the castle.
The tapestry room features as a kind of core epicenter in the legends, stories and experiences of the house. And there are lots of factors that can contribute to that. It could be simply that the room has a high traffic of people passing through it, and it does. So they're around more and thus statistically more probable to be there and to hear things and so on and so forth and experience things and so on and so forth.
The furnishings in the room also seem to play an important role.
And there's lots of Gothic imagery on it. And here in the fireplace, here on these stands, there are some devil's heads, and it's very Gothic and suggestive. And although it's very subtle, if you're in this environment, and it's a strange environment to you, you're not used to being in a castle, these sorts of things are just working in the background of your mind, slowly influencing certain people's perceptions.
That's interesting about those heads, because I'd kind of clocked them as a metal feature, but I hadn't thought, I hadn't seen the detail. I hadn't spotted that they were potentially sinister. Yeah. And I suppose a lot of that stuff goes under the radar for people.
This also explains why visitors feel they are being observed in this room.
So we have found that people do feel more watched in rooms that have more portraits. Because I suppose really they are being watched. Now, the individuals may not necessarily make that connection in the room, but they can feel unnerved and have these sensed presence experiences in rooms that have prominent portraits.
But where do the eerie noises come from? Like the sound of a crying child.
Bear in mind that around here there can be lots of creepy noises. We're in the countryside, you can hear foxes. Foxes make horrible crying sounds. And if you believed in a ghost, you may well misinterpret that.
Even for the cold in the room, there is a simple explanation.
Now, there are some psychological reasons that we're exploring. For example, the rooms are often painted in a very cold colour that can make you feel a bit chilly, an effect known as synesthesia.
Jason Braithwaite has also found out why the door opens at night as if by magic.
The reality is this door never used to shut properly in the first place. So it would only ever just wedge like that in the door frame. It was hung in a non-straight manner. And what would also happen on certain days of atmospheric wind through that chimney, it would pull the air through, and thus, because the door was never secured in the first place, the door would open like that. And we actually witnessed this on a number of occasions.
And if you were asleep in that bed over there and you saw the door open, exactly, you would assume it was something supernatural.
Exactly. And some people have described getting up and closing the door 2 or 3 or 4 times in the evening, and it keeps opening. Well, it would do if the weather conditions were just right outside.
Jason Braithwaite can also explain why the door handle turns.
What we have found on some of the doors here, again, at certain times of the year when certain moisture content is correct, is all these fixtures and fittings, they're old and they're worn. What can happen is, as you come to turn the door and turn it round, it can stick and stay there under tension. When you then come to re-grab it, it releases that tension and it springs in your hand.
That would be incredibly alarming.
We've seen it happen many times and people do react in that way.
Deborah Hyde has stayed at the tapestry room before. What was it like for someone who does not believe in ghosts to stay in the spookiest room of the castle?
It was fine. It was absolutely fine. The only thing is that even if you don't believe in ghosts, if you have to wander around a place like this by yourself at night, your mind goes. It's just biological, it's just normal. So I had to pop down to use the ladies' room. That was uncomfortable.
Because the corridors in the castle resemble those we know from horror movies.
There's some evidence to suggest that the kind of shape of place that you're in promotes or suppresses a feeling of panic. So if you're in a long, thin corridor, you only have two places to escape. Whereas if you're in a room, you can very easily see around you and there is more place to move. So there may be a psychological reason why people panic a little bit more in these narrow spaces.
Both Ghostbusters agree. There are no real ghosts in Muncaster Castle.
People know that it has history. You're surrounded by stone and by portraits. You know, there are a lot of cues about how creepy this place should be.
Absolutely, and some of the rooms, all these cues come together and coalesce, and that's why in locations like this, which have 80 or 90 rooms, you only get experiences clustering in certain rooms. It's because that's where, by random chance or coincidence, all these things just come together and the predisposition to have the experience increases.
Dr. Braithwaite keeps coming and saying, no such thing as ghosts, no ghosts, it's all science. But he's been coming here almost for 30 years, and the ghosts are still having fun with Dr. Braithwaite.
Our next venue, the Creswell Crags on the border of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire in England. The limestone gorge hides several crevices and caves. The historian Professor Ronald Hutton is looking for traces of dark forces. According to popular belief, the Robin Hood Cave is said to be enchanted. The expert for magic and witchcraft from the University of Bristol wants to unravel the numerous secret signs on the cave walls.
The discovery of the so-called witch marks at Creswell Crags is one of the most spectacular and important for the material evidence for magic ever made. To put it simply, we usually find these marks in 2s to a dozen. Here there are hundreds and hundreds. This makes Creswell Crags the largest collection of ritual protection marks on the planet.
A sensational discovery, because even though the signs have been known for a long time, their meaning has so far remained hidden. Ronald Hutton believes he knows the solution to the mystery.
We're only just starting to understand the time period for these marks, but overwhelmingly, they seem to appear in churches in the Middle Ages. And then when the Reformation comes, the marks move from the churches into people's homes and the spaces around them, like caves. So overwhelmingly, they're from the period from around 1530 to 1900.
Ronald Hutton knows how to interpret the mysterious signs. What's behind the double V and the M?
They took these marks as magic in themselves, giving protection, and transferred them to the caves and to their homes. The conjoined V's are Virgo Virginum, the Virgin of Virgins, and the M is Maria.
The letters PM could also have a specific meaning.
And it stands probably for Puella Maria, the Maiden Mary, the Virgin Mary, the Mother of Jesus, one of the great figures of medieval Christian religion. And the letters put her protection into this place, even though the people who carved the letters would probably long have forgotten that they had anything to do with the Virgin Mary.
According to popular belief, the so-called witch signs could have served to ward off misfortune and evil. For example, as protection against evil spirits, bad harvests, or diseases.
When you live in a world that doesn't have antiseptics or antibiotics, and has so little knowledge of the origins of disease. And also is a world on the brink so full of poor people that a single act like a fire or an accident can cripple them. They like to feel they have some power over luck. So the idea that you can actually write a mark that keeps at least more bad luck away is great therapy. And that's why certain marks were regarded as being filled with power.
In addition to the signs, certain objects were thought to protect buildings, sometimes even animals.
Likewise, dead cats are often found concealed in these places so that the evil spirit will find the cat, the ghost of the cat, on duty, looking for them, and run away as a mouse or a rat would run from a live cat. Shoes are very common, perhaps because it was thought that devils, who very often seem to be regarded as quite stupid, would get into the shoe or the boot and not get out, like a mousetrap.
In the Robin Hood cave, there are religious signs as well as carvings in the shape of boxes.
We think that the meaning of the box-shaped carvings upon the walls is that they were traps for evil spirits. Literally, you would try to conjure the demons into those boxes and leave them trapped in the boxes forever.
The largest collection of witch signs is found at the very back, in the darkest part of the cave. It appears to be the gateway to the underworld, the jaws of hell. Professor Ronald Hutton can imagine why there are so many markings around the hole.
One is that this is an exceptionally scary part of the cave, and so the marks are put there to keep whatever lives in this cave in and not allow it to get out and among the local people. And the other possibility is that the evil spirits were gathered from the outside world and driven into the cave and put into a holding pen here where they're surrounded by the marks and can't get out. And so this is a spirit prison or a sin bin.
A former Benedictine monastery in Harzefeld, Lower Saxony, Germany. Daniel Nösler is hunting for the undead here. The archaeologist knows the burial rituals of our ancestors. Here, of all places, in consecrated ground, he believes to have found indications of the fear of so-called revenants. Many centuries ago, the dead were buried here in the cloister. Some graves have strange features. Are there any undead buried here?
Always and everywhere people have believed in the undead, especially in the Middle Ages, and in the early modern period, the belief in the undead was very present. There are many archaeological findings and also written sources. Our interpretation is that especially in times of epidemics or wars, people strongly believed in the undead, and this could develop into hysteria.
The archaeologist finds a first clue when he archives old excavation photos. They show skeletons from the Middle Ages, found in the 80s during an excavation in the monastic ruins of Harzefeld. On one photo, Daniel Nösler discovers something unusual.
I noticed that there was a very big stone over the head of a dead man, which could not have got there by chance, because the ground all around is free of stones, pure sand. I also noticed that there was a discoloration, which indicates that the stone was placed in the grave pit afterwards.
The examination of the skeleton shows the deceased is a man, about 20 years old. At over 5'6", he was unusually tall for his time.
The dead man, as he lies before us, was very, very well fed. That means he was certainly a member of the nobility. At that time, one could buy burial places in monasteries for one's salvation. However, there seems to have been something which raised suspicions among the descendants, or perhaps the monks.
So suspicious that they tried to keep the dead man inside his grave with a heavy stone? Daniel Nössler believes the people at that time thought he was a so-called revenant, a corpse that leaves its grave and returns to the living. The archaeologist researches and discovers more cases of dead people who seem to have been weighted down with stones. At the place of execution Unternaus in Bern, Switzerland, numerous victims of executions were probably kept in the grave that way. A stone in the mouth, however, indicates a special type of undead, the after-devourers. A corpse that does not even have to leave its grave to harm the living. The after-devourer sucks or devours his shroud, burial gown, or even his own flesh. In this way, he withdraws the life force from the bereaved, according to popular belief, even causing their death.
That's why they tried to put things under the chin of suspicious people, put things in their mouth, or even cut off their heads. It was also a matter of stopping them from eating. We have several cases of so-called after-devourers here in Dramburg in Pomerania, where the iron sickle was placed over the neck of the deceased in order to prevent this after-feeding on the one hand, and, on the other hand, to prevent them from being able to rise again. Here's another example where they just put a stone under the chin. Possibly it was put in the mouth and then fell out, post-mortem.
Other measures also point to the belief in the undead. In the 18th century, for example, the members of the noble family of Stockhausen were tied up in their coffins in Trendelberg in northern Hesse.
The dead were staked with big iron nails and wooden stakes. Heads were chopped off, legs were cut off. People were turned on their stomachs so that the spell of damage would be directed towards the earth's interior and not towards the world of the living. There are numerous ways to detect this.
Daniel Nössler assumes the dead man of Hasefeld was banished in his grave for a certain reason.
The dead man was buried in the Middle Ages, probably in the 14th century, at the time when these terrible epidemics, the Black Death, the plague, raged across Europe. We assume this young man died during one of these epidemics, and in these times of hysteria, people try to keep him in his grave with this heavy stone.
For the plague is highly contagious. If someone succumbs to it, more people die soon afterwards. Family members, friends, acquaintances. Daniel Nössler meets his colleague Dietrich Alsdorf. He was present at the excavation in the 80s.
The stone, it's a stroke of luck that it was left behind at all and wasn't shoveled away, because people thought it somehow slipped out of a war. At the time, we thought nothing of it.
Daniel Nössler reopens the case 30 years later.
The archaeology of the undead is actually a very, very young discipline. In the past, one was certainly smiled at when dealing with the topic of the undead. Today, science has become more open-minded. In addition to this, we have a whole range of newly discovered sources from folklore and history that help us to interpret these findings.
Written and pictorial sources from the Middle Ages also refer to the belief in the undead and to protective measures that are no longer archaeologically verifiable. Holy water, prayers or spells.
Through my research, I have discovered an incredible variety of undead people. It's almost impossible to quantify them. There is countless archaeological evidence, countless evidence in written sources, even the folklore is full of them. This actually means that the belief in the undead has been present everywhere, not only in Germany, but in many regions of the world.
Depending on the region, the ideas of the undead are quite different. The Headless Horseman is a revenant who appears in many legends of Europe, also in Germany, especially in Western Germany. It was believed at the time that suicides or criminals who were decapitated could become headless horsemen. According to legend, the mounted undead usually appears at night. Sometimes he only frightens his victim, but in the worst case, he robs him of his life force. The piggybacker is another ghostly figure, usually an undead who jumps on the back of his victim and plagues him, sometimes until the living person collapses dead under the weight or from exhaustion. But who would become undead?
Murderers, perjurers, people who committed suicide were suspected of becoming undead and were buried accordingly. Someone who died far from home, not buried in consecrated ground. So there were a variety of possibilities, and very importantly, if the burial rite was not perfectly observed, people suspected the person could become undead and wouldn't rest in peace.
Dietrich Alsdorf remembers another unusual burial at Hasefeld Monastery.
To our surprise, the corpse was lying on his stomach face down, and his lower legs were close together, so we could assume that he was tied up when he was buried there.
All the others were buried on their backs, according to the Christian rite, weren't they?
And there's another strange grave find.
Here we are dealing with two lower legs. Here's the chest, which is sloping. It was also divided in two. Back when we exposed it, we thought, okay, this is somebody who somehow got knocked off his horse in a fight and the opponents literally shredded him, which was quite common back then.
But Daniel Nössler believes that the man was only dismembered after his death. There's evidence to support that.
The lower legs have been placed at the top of the head, and the skull is also destroyed. In other words, a vampire was to be destroyed so that the dead man was no longer able to walk. And the chest was destroyed. Perhaps the heart was also removed to destroy his life energy.
Did the monks really allow pagan burial rites at their sanctuaries? Daniel Nössler is convinced of this and goes even further. Even at the altar, the holiest place of the former monastery church, he found an indication of the fear of the undead.
In the 1960s, excavations were carried out here during construction works. And skeletons of abbots buried here in the Middle Ages have come to light. The exciting thing was, an abbot had been fastened at his feet with a large iron lock.
Was this how they tried to bind the abbot in his grave? The lock still exists. Also an iron bell.
This little bell was found in the hand of another dead man who was discovered in the cloister. This leads us to suspect that maybe its purpose was to send a signal when someone moved in his grave.
The dead in Hasefeld Monastery are important witnesses of their time. Which conclusions can the archaeologist draw from these strange burial rituals?
What's interesting about these findings, Hasefeld Monastery was one of the most important monasteries here in the north. It was under the direct control of the Pope in Rome. If such superstitious acts were performed here, it must have been done with the approval of the monks and also with the approval of the abbots. That means that in the case of an emergency, the Christian faith was not that strong, and they preferred to resort to pagan rites.
Change of venue. Romania. Historian Peter Mario Kreuter goes on a search for traces in Wallachia. Kreuter has specialized in the southeastern European folk belief in demons and has been researching this for years. The most famous of all the undead is said to be at work here, the vampire.
Basically, it must be said that the poltergeist, moroi, vampire, or whatever you call it, is just a variation of the revenant. But what characterizes it and distinguishes it from many other forms of revenants is the fact that the ghost is always negative. He's a damaging, possibly even deadly figure. There's nothing positive about him. Therefore, one must fight him.
The vampire a la Dracula, as we know him today from books and films, is an exaggerated version of the vampire of popular belief.
Occasionally, a vampire will drink blood, but it never sucks it. There is no such thing as sharp teeth or a bite in the neck. Furthermore, its harmful activity is not limited to humans. It can also spoil the harvest, it can mess up the house, or drive the cattle crazy. Sometimes it is even claimed that it makes the milk sour right inside the body of the cow.
The vampire is supposed to extract the life energy from his victims with magical powers.
It's a very specific dead person returning. It's not a stranger. It's always someone from the family or the village. A second important point: it is harmful just because it exists, because it should not be in this world anymore.
That is why people are trying to fight him, even in the 21st century. In 2004, a case in the Wallachian village of Maratino de Zeus caused a sensation. When a man died there, members of his family allegedly fell ill. The dead man was thought to be a poltergeist who harms the bereaved. Villagers opened the grave, took the heart from the dead man and prepared a healing potion to combat the damage.
Not only did the whole thing become a media event, those who participated in the excavation were punished for disturbing the peace of the dead. So this is not something that the Romanian authorities tolerate in any way, if they find out.
Do people in Wallachia still believe in vampires today? Kreuter asks inhabitants of the village of Moldoveni. 80-year-old Stella Barbu lives there. She is a corpse washer. Together with her daughter-in-law Florica, she prepares the dead for the coffin.
Taking down, or sometimes even turning a mirror around, is a classic that is found in popular belief. It has even made it into vampire literature, where the mirror reveals whether someone's a vampire or not. The missing mirror image is seen as a vampire sign.
Stella and Florica Barbu show the historian the burial rituals to bid farewell to the deceased and remember them.
People believe the dead person is dead, but has not yet left the community. That has to be done in a proper way. It's common practice to bid farewell, to make the transition to the other world possible. If that goes wrong, the transition into the other world, other preventive measures will be taken. Not those against the bad crossing, but those against the vampire.
Does Stella Barbu still know such customs to fight the poltergeist, the vampire?
They exist.
Really?
Yes, some stab him in the navel, God forbid. And a woman was dug up here because her son was sick. They went up to her, dug her up, and found her face down. That's what we heard.
The belief in vampires, it hasn't died out until today. Even back in the 18th century, people tried to fight it. At that time, a certain Arnold Paoli is said to be up to mischief in a small Serbian village as an undead. In 1732, the military doctor Johann Flückinger sets off on a vampire hunt by order of the imperial governor. Allegedly, the body showed hardly any signs of decomposition.
We must not forget we've only really started to understand decay and rotting processes in corpses in the 19th century due to advances in chemistry and medicine.
And so, even Flückinger cannot refute the vampire belief of that time. His report spreads throughout Europe.
The most interesting thing is that in several instances, Johann Flückinger indicates this is a very old belief. People have always done these things. He writes about a story of a case that happened a few years earlier. So this Mr. Flückinger practically provided the very first folkloristic material on the belief in vampires.
More than 20 years later, Maria Theresa of Austria commissioned her personal physician to investigate vampirism. Gerard van Swieten names natural causes such as lack of air and fermentation processes for the alleged vampire characteristics on the corpse. He's not the only scholar in search of natural causes for the apparently good condition of corpses. In 1755, a decree was issued in Vienna which, among other things, prohibited the staking of the dead. But even this does not really eradicate the belief in vampires.
Of course, the whole thing was regarded as a, well, crazy, superstitious belief of uneducated farmers, but nobody really fought the belief in vampires properly. After all, it was essentially not a phenomenon of the countries where the Enlightenment ruled, but located here in southeastern Europe, a somewhat different world with regards to culture and mentality.
In the village of Moldoveni, Peter Mario Kreuter wants to know whether the corpse washer Stella Barbu herself believes in the so-called poltergeists.
I don't think they exist. Although there was a girl's father 20 years ago. The girl got sick when he was laid out dead. The girl didn't recover until they brought in someone to stab something into his belly button. That's the way it was.
But you don't believe such a thing exists.
No, I don't know. May God bless us and save us.
Her daughter-in-law, Florica Barbu, on the other hand, claims to have experienced it herself with her late brother-in-law.
We saw a teardrop in one of his eyes. My sister did not know he was a ghost. After we took him home, his daughter became sick. What is it? After that, we went to someone and he said, yes, we absolutely have to drill him. And he stabbed him around midnight. Nobody knew about it. Only he and the dead man were in the room. He stabbed him and immediately afterwards, the girl was fine again.
That's what's really important about this whole thing. People only intervene if there are actually indications that something's wrong. Dead bodies are not simply staked out systematically just to be on the safe side. Nor do people live in fear of a ghost all the time. No, If something is wrong, then measures must be taken. And that's all there is to it.
Even spindles like these are said to be able to repel a poltergeist.
When the dead man is buried, 4 spindles, 2 here, 2 there, are placed in the coffin so the vampire can't return.
In this case, these spindles are intended for defense. I assume they are placed in the coffin because they are pointed, so that if the vampire does move, it will get pierced and thereby prevent it from leaving the grave.
Peter Mario Kreuter's search for evidence continues. The belief in the undead still seems to be alive and kicking in many a villager. Kreuter wants to know more and talks to a couple. Okia Tedose also works as a corpse washer and knows what to do in an emergency.
What do you do with a ghost? Pierce it. I am the boss, so I go there and I stab it with the tooth of a weaving reed. After an hour or 2, I go there, we undress him. I stab straight into the navel, and it's good. But it's even better to stab the heart. The heart controls the whole body of the person. The heart and the head. This vampire thing is very, very dangerous. If you do not pierce him, he will come and take all the children.
Supposedly, there are indications as to which child could later become a vampire already at birth.
If the mother gives birth to her child with a caul and people do not pay attention and do not take the caul off its head, the child will eat it.
Yeah. A neighbour said to us, "You have to stab me when I die because I'm a vampire. My mother gave birth to me with a caul on my head."
The couple tells him how an undead is supposed to make itself felt.
If no one punctures him, the poltergeist comes home and he breaks plates. He brawls around the house.
He rumbles about.
When a man and his family drove to the cornfields, the oxen pulling the cart suddenly stopped because an undead appeared.
He made noises and moaned.
What about the oxen?
He couldn't see a thing.
The poltergeist, the one that comes and disturbs people, it can also drive the animals crazy or frighten them. It can, for example, spoil the harvest. It doesn't have to make people sick. As I said, it can also break the dishes, do all sorts of things. I'm gathering very interesting information here. All these elements are really very nice and vivid.
S apropie ușor de pat și o privește mai atent.
How does the church deal with the popular belief in ghosts, in vampires and the undead? The vampire expert meets the priest Nita Florica and wants to know what he thinks about it.
Citește ce e scris în el.
The church is prepared for everything. For unclean souls, we have special prayers, and we have special masses. We have the right medicine to heal the cursed, for example. We have a prayer for souls who cannot leave their bodies, when the exit of the soul is difficult and the soul is struggling with death.
For him, too, it means something if he can help someone to leave this world to pass into another world. Even if he uses prayers and the rituals of the Romanian Orthodox Church.
So Peter Mario Kreuter has found what he was looking for in his search for the undead. Here in Romania, especially in the countryside, the belief in ghosts is still alive today, and it's deeply rooted in the customs of the locals. This popular belief still plays an important role in their lives.